if I was a Russian, I would be more worried about China than I would be by the United States or Western Europe or Ukraine.
So here we are discussing the supposed relative decline of the West and rise of China and maybe India. But actually, the actions of China and Russia in particular recently have strengthened the West. So you've laid out how China's actions have brought new allies to the West in Taiwan. What Putin has done has strengthened NATO, and now Sweden and Finland are joining NATO. And the West seems much more united. Have we actually got this wrong?
Well, if I was a Russian, I would be more worried about China than I would be by the United States or Western Europe or Ukraine. Why? Because Russia is a declining power. People see this vast area of Russia. The population of Russia today is 150 million, which is the same as France and Germany combined. Its GDP is much the same as Italy or the Netherlands. Somebody in the 19th century said that Russia has only two friends during the Tsarist period, its army and its navy. Somebody recently said Russia today has only two friends, its oil and its gas. And its gas, of course, is no longer selling to Europe. So if I was a Russian, I would know, because it's self-evident, neither America nor Europe has a claim against a single square inch or centimeter of Russian territory. That is not the same as is necessarily going to be the case of China with Russia. We know a city called Vladivostok on the far east of Siberia. About 10 million out of 150 million are the only people who live in that part of, perhaps 15 million, who live in that part of the Russian Federation. It's a huge empty space. Where Vladivostok is, that whole region was part of China, part of the Chinese Empire, until 1867, when it was forced, when it was weak, the time it was ceding Hong Kong to Britain and making other concessions to others, it was forced to cede that territory to Russia. So although we don't hear about that at the moment, we know that Russia, because it's so weak at the moment, it relies on China to buy its oil and gas. It relies on China to support it diplomatically, because nobody else does worth knowing. And it's having to make major concessions in terms of its own economic interests and its own political interests. So one day there will be a statesman in Russia rather than a dictator who will not be an enemy of China, but will say, look, that's the country we have to deal with because it's the only country in the world that is likely to claim large chunks of Russia in the foreseeable future.
Can I add just a little bit to this? Because you actually, as we look around the world, although Putin is actually bragging in the fact that the vast majority of the world's population, actually more supportive of Russia in maybe a passive sense from either abstaining from UN resolutions. There is already a very strong feeling, particularly in some of the BRICS countries, for example, Brazil, and even in South Africa, that Russia's declined dramatically as a result of the war. My colleagues and I at Brookings recently had a series of discussions with some Brazilian counterparts. And the Brazilians were actually more likely to see the war in Ukraine as a proxy war between the US and China than they were between the US and Russia, because they see Russia as already dependent on China in the ways that Sir Malcolm has described here. And this was just before President Lula went on his visit to China, and they said that Lula wanted to hear what the Chinese thought about the war in Ukraine, not really what the Russians wanted to see. And that they were already seeing Russia declining as an economic partner as well, apart from in fertilizer, for example, because the Brazilians don't buy a lot of Russian oil and obviously gas. And if you start to kind of, look around, just as Sir Malcolm is saying, Russia definitely does not have the moral high ground on this, despite, what appears to be some, support for Putin. People are very happy to have Russian money, particularly in the Gulf at the moment, because, Russian oligarchs are moving their money from the Cypresses and all the other kind of places they used to have it and into Dubai. But they're just seeing opportunity out of this. They're not necessarily seeing this as, new sets of partnerships. So I think, just exactly as Malcolm has said, we're going to see Russia in a very different place. And the demographics is very important here too, because just as other countries have seeing their populations rising, the Russian population is going to decline even further as a result of the war. If it really is the case that in Bakhmut alone, as Mr. Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group, has said, that the Russians have lost 20,000 men, And you already have, a couple of 100,000, as we're hearing in other statistics, disabled in some fashion. And you've got 1.3 million Russians who have left to either avoid the draft or because they don't want to be part of the war. You can start doing the math, because these are the younger, most progressive parts of the population. We've seen over every major conflict a massive drop in population. So although we're seeing that in Ukraine as well, we're going to see that in Russia too. So we're much more likely to see a different configuration going ahead. Whether Putin thinks he's won this or can last everyone out, he's completely and utterly destroying the future of Russia for some, considerable period of time, which is not to say that Russia won't be with us. I think that's, quite the contrary. But it will not be the same Russia in terms of a kind of a more positive force, demographically, economically, and politically than it could have been in the past, for sure.
Just a couple very short points. China's position on Ukraine is much more interesting than is sometimes realized. First of all, it has never, despite being Putin's closest chum, China has never voted with Russia to support what Russia has done in Ukraine. It's always abstained and refused to recognize the annexation of Ukrainian territory. But the most interesting thing, you will all recall how a few months ago there was deep concern that tactical nuclear weapons might be used by Russia to put pressure on Ukraine and on the West. Now, no one can rule that out, but it seems to have gone away. And if it has gone away, the single most important reason would have been a conversation Xi Jinping had with Putin when he said, if you ever think of using tactical nuclear weapons, we will condemn you, as will India and other countries. But then why is China saying that? Not because it is a nice bunch of guys concerned with nuclear weapons. What China is deeply worried is if a non-nuclear state like Ukraine was successfully blackmailed by a nuclear weapon state like Russia and got away with it, who would be tempted to go the same way? Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, all of whom are non-nuclear and all of whom have the capacity to develop nuclear weapons if they so chose. And that is why China, fortunately on this issue, its own interests coincide with the sane views of the vast majority of the world.
Interesting.
Can I?
Yes.
On this, can I just come in on this point, China-Russia relations? And you mentioned Vladivostok. Russian Far East is where I spent a lot of time doing research in Siberia and crossing the border between Russia and China. So when Putin came to power, what he had announced was, first he said, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And then he said the development of the Russian Far East is the biggest geopolitical priority for the Russian state, because if you take Siberia and the Russian Far East, that's roughly 2/3 of Russia's territories and very small population. Currently, because of the ongoing emigration from the Far East to the European parts, about 6.5 million population. I have participated in a number of conferences in the Far East about how to solve demographic problems, and they try to bring in, they're afraid of Chinese migrants taking over. But now the Chinese are not going as labor migrants because they have plenty of jobs in China. So then they're afraid, they try to bring in Vietnamese workers who went to Moscow and European parts. Then Putin signed a deal with Modi. He invited Modi this to annual conference in the Russian Far East to bring Indians, but the Indians will not go anyway.
Too cold.
So it's too cold and so many problems. So the Russian Far East is completely neglected, and China has effectively been acquiring control. So a lot of Russian opposition leaders, Khodorkovsky, Maxim Katz and many others have been talking about how Putin has completely sold out to China, and Russia has become a vassal state of China, and China is seeking to restore the humiliation in the 19th century when the border was demarcated, where a lot of these areas which are now part of Russian Federation were actually Chinese, and China still, Vladivostok and all these places, China still uses the Chinese names.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.